The rusted fence stretched endlessly along the abandoned highway, its metal posts weathered by decades of desert storms. Most travelers never bothered to look twice at this forgotten stretch of road outside Millbrook, Arizona. But on this particular Tuesday morning in November, Marcus Chun pulled his pickup truck to a sudden stop, dust clouds swirling around his tires. What he saw through his windshield would haunt him for years to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 figures were bound to that fence. A woman in her 40s, her dark hair matted with dirt, and 2 young girls who couldn't have been older than 12 and 14. Their wrists were secured with thick rope, their clothes torn and stained. The woman's eyes met Marcus's through the glass, and in that moment, he saw something that made his blood run cold, not just fear, but a desperate plea that seemed to say everything and nothing at once. Marcus had driven this route every Tuesday for the past 3 years, delivering medical supplies to rural clinics across the county. He knew every pothole, every landmark, every abandoned building along this stretch, but he had never seen anything like this. As he sat there, engine idling, 1,000 questions raced through his mind. Who were these people? How long had they been there? And most importantly, what was he about to walk into? Marcus Chun had always been a man of few words. At 38, he'd learned that action spoke louder than lengthy conversations, a lesson hammered into him during his 8 years as an Army medic before returning to civilian life in Arizona. His job with Southwestern Medical Supply suited him perfectly. Long stretches of solitary driving punctuated by brief, professional interactions at rural clinics and hospitals. The morning had started like any other. He'd loaded his refrigerated truck with insulin, antibiotics, and surgical supplies at the Phoenix warehouse before dawn, then headed east toward the smaller communities that dotted the desert landscape. His first stop was supposed to be the Millbrook Community Health Center, a small clinic that served 3 surrounding towns and treated everyone from ranchers to migrant workers. The road to Millbrook was a 2-lane ribbon of cracked asphalt that cut through miles of scrubland dotted with saguaro cacti and ocotillo plants. Marcus had made this drive 156 times in the past 3 years. He kept count in a small notebook he carried, a habit left over from his military days. The landscape rarely changed, save for the occasional new roadkill or a shift in the seasonal wildflowers. But today, something was different. The fence had always been there, running parallel to the highway for about 2 miles before disappearing into a wash that cut through the desert floor. It was old ranch fencing, probably installed decades ago when this area still supported cattle operations. Most of the wire was gone now, leaving only the metal posts and a few stubborn sections of rusted chain link. Marcus first noticed movement about a quarter-mile ahead. His initial thought was that some livestock had gotten loose. It wouldn't be the first time he'd encountered stray cattle or horses wandering near the road. But as he drew closer, the shapes became more defined, more distinctly human. He slowed the truck, squinting through the windshield. The desert sun was already fierce despite the early hour, creating heat mirages that danced across the asphalt. But there was no mistaking what he was seeing now. 3 people, bound to the fence posts, their bodies slumped in exhaustion or unconsciousness. Marcus pulled to the shoulder and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. No wind, no birds, no traffic. Just the faint ticking of his cooling engine and the sound of his own breathing. He reached for his cell phone out of instinct, then remembered where he was. This stretch of highway was a dead zone for cell service, something that had frustrated him on previous trips, when he'd needed to contact the clinics about delivery delays. Through his windshield, he studied the scene more carefully. The woman appeared to be in her mid-40s, Hispanic, wearing what looked like a blue dress that had once been clean but was now stained with dirt and sweat. Her black hair hung in tangles around her face, and even from this distance, Marcus could see that her lips were cracked and dry. She was conscious, her eyes fixed on his truck with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. The two girls flanked her on either side. The younger one, maybe 11 or 12, had her head hanging down, chin touching her chest. Her long dark hair obscured her face, but Marcus could see the rise and fall of her small shoulders as she breathed. She wore a pink t-shirt and jeans that were too big for her thin frame. The older girl was perhaps 13 or 14. She was awake and alert, her eyes darting between Marcus's truck and something off to the left that he couldn't see from his position. Her clothes were similar to her sister's casual, everyday wear that suggested they hadn't been dressed for whatever ordeal had brought them here. All three were secured to the fence posts with what appeared to be climbing rope, the kind used by rock climbers and construction workers. Their hands were bound behind the posts, and additional rope circled their waists, holding them upright. The knots were professionally tied, not the hasty work of an amateur, but the careful, methodical binding of someone who knew what they were doing. Marcus opened his truck door slowly, the hinges creaking in the desert quiet. The woman's head lifted slightly, and he saw her mouth move, though no sound reached him across the 30 yards that separated them. Her eyes were pleading, desperate, but there was something else there too, a warning, perhaps, or fear, not just for herself, but for him. He stepped out of the truck and immediately felt the desert heat hit him like a physical blow. It was going to be another scorching day, with temperatures probably reaching 110 degrees by afternoon. These people had been exposed to this sun for who knew how long. Dehydration was a serious concern, especially for the children. Marcus walked slowly toward the fence, his medical training automatically kicking in as he assessed the situation. The woman showed signs of severe dehydration: sunken eyes, dry mucous membranes, skin that had lost its elasticity. The girls appeared to be in similar condition, though the younger one seemed to be in the worst shape. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and her skin had a grayish pallor that Marcus recognized as a sign of shock as he approached. The woman spoke, her voice barely a whisper carried on the desert air. "Please," she said in accented English. "Please help my daughters." Marcus was now close enough to see the rope burns on their wrists, the way the harsh fibers had chafed their skin raw. The woman's dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing a dark bruise that extended down her arm. The older girl's lip was split and swollen, dried blood caked at the corner of her mouth. "How long have you been here?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure they had enough moisture left in their mouths to answer properly. Since yesterday morning," the woman managed. "Maybe longer, we lost track. More than 24 hours in the desert sun." Marcus did quick calculations in his head: average water loss in this heat, the increased rate for children, the signs of organ failure that would begin to manifest soon. They were in serious trouble. He moved to the younger girl first, kneeling beside her and gently lifting her chin. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. Her breathing was definitely too fast, too shallow. Classic signs of heat exhaustion progressing toward heat stroke. "What's her name?" he asked the woman. "Sophia," came the reply. "She's 11. Marcus checked Sophia's pulse, rapid and thready. Her skin was hot to the touch but dry, which was a bad sign. Her body had stopped sweating, meaning her cooling system was shutting down. Without immediate intervention, she could go into cardiac arrest. The older girl was in better shape, but still critical. She watched Marcus with intelligent eyes that held a maturity no 14-year-old should possess. When he looked at her directly, she mouthed a single word: "Careful." Marcus glanced around the desert landscape, suddenly aware that whoever had done this might still be nearby. The warning in the girl's eyes suggested they weren't alone, that there were factors at play he didn't yet understand. But these three people were dying in front of him, and his medical training overrode any concerns for his personal safety. He returned to his truck and retrieved the emergency medical kit he always carried, along with several bottles of water from his personal Supply. The pharmaceutical cargo in the back of his truck was temperature-controlled and locked, but his basic first aid supplies were easily accessible. When he returned to the fence, the woman was looking at him with something approaching hope. You're not with them?" she asked. "I'm a medical supply driver," Marcus said simply. "I'm going to get you out of here." He started with Sophia, using a small knife from his kit to carefully cut through the ropes binding her wrists. The moment her arms were free, she collapsed forward, and Marcus caught her small frame against his chest. She was burning up with fever, her body's attempt to cool itself having failed completely. Working quickly, Marcus laid her in the shade of his truck and began emergency cooling procedures. He soaked one of his shirts with water and placed it on her forehead, then began slowly dripping water onto her cracked lips. Too much too fast would make her vomit, but she desperately needed fluid replacement. The older girl, whose name he'd learned was Carmen, was able to walk with assistance once freed. She stumbled twice on the short distance to the truck, her legs weak from being in one position for so long, but her eyes remained alert and focused. The woman, who introduced herself as Elena Valdez, was the strongest of the three, though that wasn't saying much. As Marcus cut her bonds, she kept looking over her shoulder toward a cluster of rocks about 100 yards away. "They said they'd be back," Elena whispered urgently as Marcus helped her to the truck. "The men who did this. They said they had business to finish." Marcus felt a chill despite the desert heat. How many men? 3, maybe 4. They had guns. As if summoned by her words, Marcus heard the distant sound of engines approaching from the direction of the rock cluster. Not one vehicle, but several, their engines echoing off the desert floor in a way that made it impossible to determine exactly how far away they were. Elena grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You need to leave," she said. "Take the girls and go. Leave me here." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus looked at Sophia, who was just beginning to respond to the cooling treatment, but was nowhere near stable. Carmen sat beside her sister, holding her hand and whispering reassurances in Spanish. Both girls needed immediate medical attention, preferably in a hospital setting. The engine sounds were getting closer. Marcus made a decision that would change all their lives. Instead of driving away or trying to negotiate with whoever was coming, he did something that reflected both his military training and his fundamental nature as a healer. He picked up Sophia and placed her gently in the passenger seat of his truck, then helped Carmen into the middle of the bench seat. "Get in," he told Elena. "But they'll follow us," she protested. "They'll hurt you too." Marcus was already behind the wheel, starting the engine. "Let me worry about that." As they pulled away from the fence, Marcus caught sight of 3 dust clouds. In his rearview mirror, vehicles emerging from the rocks and moving fast in their direction. But his truck had a head start, and he knew these roads better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. More importantly, he had a refrigerated cargo bay full of medical supplies, including 4 fluids and medications that could save Sophia's life. The nearest hospital was 45 minutes away under normal circumstances. But Marcus wasn't planning on normal circumstances. As the truck accelerated down the desert highway, Elena began to tell him who they were and why they'd been tied to that fence. The story that emerged was one of desperation, violence, and a kind of evil that Marcus had hoped to leave behind when he returned from his tours overseas. But even as Elena talked, Sophia's condition continued to deteriorate in the seat beside him, and the dust clouds in his mirror were getting closer. Elena's story came in fragments between her labored breathing and Sophia's occasional whimpers. Marcus kept one eye on the road and another on his rearview mirror as she spoke, the pursuing vehicles now visible as black dots against the desert landscape. "My husband Roberto died 8 months ago," Elena began, her voice steadier now that they were moving. "Construction accident in Phoenix. The company said it wasn't their fault, but Roberto always followed safety protocols. Always. The truck hit a pothole, jarring Sofia awake. She looked around with confused eyes before Carmen whispered something in Spanish that seemed to calm her. Marcus reached over and checked her pulse, still too fast, but at least she was conscious. After Roberto died, the bills started piling up, Elena continued. Medical expenses from before he passed, funeral costs, the mortgage. I took 3 jobs cleaning offices at night, working at a grocery store during the day, watching children for neighbors on weekends. But it wasn't enough. Marcus downshifted as they approached a steep grade. The pursuing vehicles had closed some distance, but his truck's diesel engine was built for hauling heavy loads through difficult terrain. He had advantages they didn't. A man came to our house 6 weeks ago, Elena said. Well-dressed, polite. Said his name was Mr. Davidson. He knew about Roberto's death, knew about our financial situation. He said he could help. Carmen looked up at her mother with eyes that held too much knowledge for a 14-year-old. Mama tried to say no, she said in careful English, but he said he already knew where Sofia went to school. The threat was implicit but clear. Elena's voice hardened as she continued. Davidson said he ran a business helping families in difficult situations. All I had to do was allow my house to be used for storage sometimes. He would pay me $2,000 a month, enough to keep us afloat while I figured out something permanent. Marcus crested the hill and could see the town of Millbrook spread out in the valley below. The community health center was visible as a low white building near the center of town. But he was beginning to realize that their destination might not be as simple as dropping the family off at a medical facility. What kind of storage? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I didn't ask at first, Elena admitted. I should have, but I was desperate. Davidson's men would come by twice a week, usually at night. They'd bring wooden crates, about the size of toolboxes, and store them in our garage. Then other men would come and take them away. Sofia stirred again, trying to sit up straighter. Marcus could see that the color was slowly returning to her face as the truck's air conditioning and the water he'd given her began to take effect. But she was far from out of danger. The crates were heavy, Carmen added. Too heavy for wood and whatever was supposed to be inside. And they smelled funny, like metal and oil. Elena shot her daughter a look that suggested this was information that shouldn't be shared freely. But they were past the point of secrets now. 3 weeks ago, one of the crates broke open when they were loading it. I saw what was inside. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. His military experience had taught him to recognize the signs of weapons trafficking, and everything Elena was describing fit the pattern perfectly. Guns, Elena said simply. Military-style rifles, handguns, ammunition. Enough weapons to supply a small army. The pursuing vehicles were gaining ground on the downhill stretch. Marcus could now make out details, 2 pickup trucks and what looked like a black SUV. The trucks had been modified with roll bars and oversized tires, suggesting they were built for off-road pursuit. I told Davidson I wanted out, Elena continued. Said I couldn't be part of whatever he was doing. That's when his whole attitude changed. The polite businessman disappeared, and I saw what he really was. Carmen's hand found her mother's, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that spoke of shared trauma. He said we knew too much, Carmen whispered. Said we were liabilities that needed to be managed. Elena's voice became flat, detached, as if she were recounting someone else's nightmare. Davidson's men came to the house yesterday morning. They said they were moving operations, that our garage was no longer suitable for their needs. But instead of just taking their weapons and leaving, they took us. Marcus navigated through Millbrook's main street, past the post office and the single gas station that served the community. Several residents looked up from their morning routines to watch the medical supply truck pass, probably wondering why he was driving so fast through their quiet town. They drove us out to the desert, Elena continued. Said they needed time to think about what to do with us. The fence was supposed to be temporary, just until they decided whether we were more valuable alive or dead. The health center was just ahead, but Marcus realized with growing concern that stopping there might put more innocent people in danger. The facility was small, with perhaps 6 staff members on duty at any given time. If Davidson's men were willing to kidnap and potentially murder a mother and her children, they wouldn't hesitate to harm medical personnel. Sophia suddenly sat up straighter, her eyes focusing on something outside the truck. "Mama," she said in Spanish, her voice weak but urgent. "The black car from our neighborhood." Marcus followed her gaze and felt his blood run cold. Parked across the street from the health center was a black sedan with tinted windows. It could have been coincidence. There were probably dozens of similar vehicles in the area. But the way it was positioned, with a clear view of the medical facility's entrance, suggested otherwise. Elena saw it too and grabbed Marcus's arm. "Don't stop," she said urgently. "They're already here." They knew we'd need medical attention. Marcus drove past the health center without slowing, his mind racing through alternatives. The next nearest hospital was in Tucson, more than an hour away. Sophia needed medical attention soon, but walking into a trap wouldn't help anyone. "How did they find us so fast?" Carmen asked, echoing Marcus's own thoughts. Elena was quiet for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device that Marcus recognized as a GPS tracker. "Davidson gave this to me weeks ago," she said bitterly. "Said it was for my safety, so his men would know where to find me if there was an emergency." I was so naive. Marcus pulled into an alley behind a hardware store and took the device from Elena's hand. It was a commercial GPS tracker, the kind used by delivery companies to monitor their vehicles. Simple, effective, and nearly impossible to disable without the right tools. "When did you last see this activated?" he asked. "I don't know how these things work," Elena admitted. "Davidson just told me to keep it with me always." Marcus examined the device more closely. It was about the size of a matchbox with a small LED light that blinked green every few seconds. The battery indicator showed it was fully charged, meaning it had probably been transmitting their location continuously. He made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation he'd developed over the years. Instead of trying to destroy the tracker or find a way to escape the net that was closing around them, Marcus handed the device back to Elena. "Keep it," he said. Elena stared at him in confusion. "But they'll follow us wherever we go." "That's the idea," Marcus replied. He pulled out his cell phone, grateful to see that they were back in a service area. "I'm going to make a call, but first I need to know something. Besides Davidson and his men, who else knows about the weapons trafficking?" Elena shook her head. "No one. Davidson made it clear that talking to anyone would be dangerous for my family." "What about the police, FBI, anyone in law enforcement?" "Davidson said he had connections everywhere," Carmen answered. "Said that even if we went to the police, his friends would make sure nothing happened to him." Marcus scrolled through his phone contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez had been his commanding officer during his final deployment, and she now worked with a joint task force that investigated weapons trafficking on the Mexican border. "Sarah, it's Marcus Chun." He spoke quietly but urgently when she answered. "I need your help, and I need it fast." As he explained the situation, Marcus watched the pursuing vehicles enter Millbrook's main street. They moved slowly, methodically, checking each business and side street. Professional, organized, dangerous. "Marcus, you need to get those people to safety immediately," Sarah said after he'd finished his account. "What you're describing sounds like the Sinaloa pipeline we've been tracking for months. These aren't local criminals, they're part of a major trafficking network." Can you send federal agents? I can have a team there in 4 hours, maybe 3 if we're lucky. But that's too long if they've already found you. Sophia chose that moment to lean forward and vomit on the truck's floorboard. The stress and dehydration were taking their toll, and Marcus realized that medical attention couldn't wait much longer. Sarah, I need you to patch me through to the Tucson FBI field office, Marcus said. And then I need you to do something that might sound crazy. 20 minutes later, Marcus was back on the highway, driving toward Tucson with Elena and her daughters. But now they weren't running from Davidson's men, they were leading them into a carefully orchestrated trap. The GPS tracker in Elena's pocket continued to broadcast their location, while Sarah Martinez coordinated with federal agents, local law enforcement, and Border Patrol units. The net was being cast, but it required Davidson's men to follow the bait. Carmen had taken over caring for Sophia, using techniques Marcus had taught her during their brief stop behind the hardware store. The younger girl was stable but weak, and Marcus knew they were racing against time on multiple fronts. Will this work? Elena asked as they passed the turnoff to 3 Points, a small community that marked the halfway point to Tucson. Marcus checked his mirror. The pursuing vehicles had maintained their distance, probably believing they were herding their prey toward an inevitable confrontation. What they didn't know was that their own radio communications were being monitored, their license plates were being traced, and a team of federal agents was positioning themselves along multiple possible routes. It has to work, Marcus replied. But privately, he was thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, and what would happen to Elena's family if it did. The desert stretched endlessly ahead of them, heat shimmers rising from the asphalt like ghosts. In the distance, storm clouds were building on the horizon, promising an afternoon thunderstorm that might change everything. Sophia opened her eyes and looked directly at Marcus. For the first time since he'd found them tied to that fence, she smiled. That's when he knew they were going to make it. The first raindrops hit Marcus's windshield just as they passed the Saguaro National Park entrance. What had started as distant storm clouds was now a towering wall of dark gray that seemed to swallow the desert horizon. Lightning flickered in the distance, and Marcus could smell the distinctive scent of creosote and wet earth that preceded a desert monsoon. This could work in our favor, he muttered, checking his mirrors. The pursuing vehicles had dropped back slightly, probably adjusting their strategy for the changing weather conditions. Elena shifted in her seat, her attention divided between watching Sophia's breathing and scanning the road behind them. In Sonora, where I grew up, storms like this could wash out roads in minutes, she said. Flash floods, zero visibility. Carmen looked up from where she was monitoring her sister's pulse, a skill Marcus had taught her during their brief stop. Are we still going to the hospital? Marcus shook his head. Change of plans. There's an abandoned gas station about 10 miles ahead, just before the highway splits toward Tucson. Federal agents are already positioning themselves there. The rain intensified suddenly, as desert storms often do. Within minutes, Marcus had to slow to 40 miles per hour as the windshield wipers struggled against the deluge. The temperature dropped 15 degrees, and Sophia stirred as the cool air filtered through the truck's ventilation system. How are you feeling, Mia? Elena asked her younger daughter in Spanish. Sophia's response was stronger than it had been all morning. Better, Mama. The cold feels good. But Marcus knew that while the rain might provide temporary relief from the heat, Sophia still needed professional medical attention. Her pulse was steadier, but dehydration didn't resolve itself completely. Just because someone felt temporarily better, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Martinez. Agents in position. ETA on your arrival? Marcus typed back with one hand while navigating through the rain. 15 minutes if weather holds. The abandoned gas station had been a landmark on this route for as long as Marcus could remember. Built in the 1960s during the heyday of cross-country road trips, It had closed sometime in the 1990s, when the interstate bypass diverted most traffic away from this older highway. The building was still structurally sound, with a large overhang that had once sheltered cars getting fuel and service. More importantly, it offered multiple escape routes and clear sightlines in all directions, assuming the rain didn't reduce. Visibility to 0. Elena was studying something in her side mirror with increasing concern. "They're getting closer again," she said. "And I think there are more of them now." Marcus adjusted his mirror and confirmed her observation. The original 3 vehicles had been joined by at least 2 others, creating a convoy that was now less than a quarter-mile behind them. Davidson's men were making their move. "Mama," Carmen said quietly, "what if the police can't stop them?" Elena reached back and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Then we trust in Mr. Chun and keep fighting. We don't give up." The simplicity of her statement struck Marcus with unexpected force. Elena had every reason to be paralyzed by fear. She'd watched her husband die, struggled to keep her family afloat, been betrayed by someone she'd trusted, and spent over 24 hours believing she and her daughters might not survive. Yet here she was, ready to keep fighting. The gas station appeared through the rain like a mirage, its faded red and white sign barely visible against the storm-darkened sky. Marcus could see 2 unmarked vehicles parked behind the building, positioned so they wouldn't be visible from the highway. Sarah had kept her word. As Marcus pulled under the station's overhang, the sudden absence of rain on the windshield was almost startling. He killed the engine and immediately heard voices speaking in the clipped, professional tones of federal agents coordinating an operation. A woman in her 40s emerged from behind one of the unmarked cars, wearing a FBI windbreaker over tactical gear. She approached the truck with the confident stride of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "Marcus Chun?" she asked as he stepped out of the truck. "That's me." "You must be Agent Rodriguez." She nodded. "Sarah Martinez briefed me on the situation. We need to get your passengers to safety before Davidson's people arrive." But even as she spoke, the sound of multiple engines became audible over the rain. The pursuing convoy was approaching fast, and there wasn't time for a lengthy evacuation. Elena opened her door, but remained in the truck. "They're almost here," she said. "Sophia can't run, and I won't leave her." Agent Rodriguez made a quick assessment of the situation. "How many vehicles in pursuit?" "5, maybe 6, Marcus replied. "Armed men, probably with military-grade weapons. Against 8 federal agents and local backup that's en route." Rodriguez's expression was grim but determined. The odds could be worse. Sophia chose that moment to sit up straighter, her eyes more alert than they'd been all day. "I can walk," she said. "In careful English, if I have to." Carmen immediately moved to support her sister. "We stay together," she declared with the fierce protectiveness of an older sibling. The first of Davidson's vehicles appeared through the rain. A black pickup truck with oversized tires and tinted windows. It slowed as it approached the gas station, its occupants clearly trying to assess the situation. Agent Rodriguez spoke into her radio in rapid, coded language that Marcus recognized from his military days. She was coordinating positions, establishing fields of fire, and preparing for multiple contingencies. "Mr. Chun," she said, "I need you to take Elena and her daughters into the station building. There's a back room that will provide better protection." Marcus helped Sophia out of the truck, surprised by how much stronger she seemed after the cooling effects of the storm. Carmen stayed close to her sister's side while Elena gathered what few possessions they had. The interior of the abandoned gas station was dusty and filled with debris, but the walls were solid concrete block that would stop most small arms fire. Agent Rodriguez had clearly chosen this location carefully. "In here," Marcus said, guiding the family toward what had once been the station's office. The room had a single window that faced away from the highway, and a back door that led to the desert beyond. Outside, more vehicles were arriving. Marcus could hear car doors slamming and voices calling out in Spanish and English. Davidson's men were positioning themselves around the building, but they didn't yet seem to realize they were walking into a federal operation. Alina pulled her daughters close as they settled into the relative safety of the back room. "Whatever happens," she told them quietly, "remember that we fought back. We didn't just accept what they wanted to do to us." Sophia nodded solemnly, while Carmen's jaw set with a determination that reminded Marcus of career soldiers he'd known. These weren't victims anymore, they were survivors. Agent Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. "They're attempting to surround the building," she reported. "But they don't know about our positioning. We have agents in the rocks about 50 yards out, and local law enforcement is blocking the highway in both directions." A voice called out from somewhere near the front of the building, amplified by a megaphone. "We know you're in there. Send out the woman and her kids, and nobody else gets hurt." Rodriguez shook her head. "Standard intimidation tactic. They're hoping to flush you out before they realize what they're really dealing with." Marcus moved to the window and carefully peered through a gap in the boards that covered it. He could see at least 4 men positioning themselves behind vehicles and desert rocks. They moved with the practiced efficiency of military veterans, suggesting Davidson's operation was more sophisticated than even Sarah Martinez had suspected. "Federal agents!" Rodriguez's voice boomed through a bullhorn. "You are surrounded. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." The response was immediate and violent. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions, bullets striking the concrete walls of the station and sending chunks of masonry flying. Marcus threw himself over Elena and her daughters as the back window exploded inward, showering them with glass. The firefight that followed was intense but brief. Federal agents returned fire from concealed positions, their superior training and positioning quickly becoming apparent. Marcus heard the distinctive whine of ricochets and the deeper crack of high-powered rifles. Sophia pressed her face against her mother's shoulder, but she wasn't crying. Carmen actually raised her head to listen to the tactical radio chatter coming from Agent Rodriguez's equipment. "They're falling back," Rodriguez announced after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. "Looks like they're trying to reach their vehicles." But the net was already closing. Marcus could hear sirens approaching from multiple directions as local law enforcement units moved in to block escape routes. Sarah Martinez had coordinated a textbook operation, using Davidson's men's own aggression against them. "Mama," Sophia said suddenly, "I think I'm going to be okay." Alina looked down at her daughter with tears in her eyes. "We're all going to be okay, Mia." The shooting stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Agent Rodriguez spoke into her radio then. "Turn to Marcus and the family. We have 6 suspects in custody. 2 others are being pursued by ground units. The immediate threat is over." Marcus helped Alina and her daughters to their feet, checking each of them for injuries from the flying glass. Sophia had a small cut on her forehead, but otherwise they were unharmed. As they emerged from the building, Marcus was struck by the transformation of the scene. What had been an abandoned gas station in the middle of nowhere was now swarming with federal agents, local police, and emergency medical personnel. The desert rain continued to fall, washing the dust and cordite from the air. A paramedic immediately began examining Sophia, while Agent Rodriguez briefed Alina on what would happen next. There would be statements to give, testimony to provide, and a new life to build far from Davidson's criminal network. But as Marcus watched Alina hold her daughters close, he realized that the most important battle had already been won. A family that had been torn apart by desperation and violence had been brought back together by courage and the simple refusal to give up hope. Sophia looked up at him from the paramedic's gurney and smiled again. This time, Marcus smiled back. The storm was passing, and the desert was already beginning to bloom. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the abandoned gas station, Marcus found himself sitting in a Phoenix courthouse waiting room, watching Elena practice her testimony with a federal prosecutor. Sophia and Carmen sat nearby, coloring in books provided by the Victim Services Coordinator, their young voices mixing English and Spanish. As they discussed which crayons to use. The transformation in all three was remarkable. Sophia had spent 2 days in the hospital recovering from severe dehydration, but her natural resilience had surprised even the medical staff. Carmen had thrown herself into learning everything she could about the legal process, asking questions that made the prosecutors smile and shake their heads in amazement. Elena, meanwhile, had discovered a strength she didn't know she possessed. The frightened widow who had accepted Davidson's dangerous offer out of desperation had evolved into a determined woman preparing to testify against one of the Southwest's largest weapons trafficking networks. Mrs. Valdez, the prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Janet Chun, was saying, "When you describe the contents of the crates, be specific about what you saw. The jury needs to understand the scope of the operation." Elena nodded, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "I understand. I saw assault rifles, handguns, and boxes of ammunition. The rifles looked military, not like hunting weapons." Marcus had been attending these preparation sessions when his work schedule allowed. His testimony about finding the family and the subsequent pursuit would be crucial to establishing the timeline and the danger the Valdez family had faced. But there was another reason he kept coming back to these meetings. Over the past 3 weeks, Marcus had found himself thinking more and more about family, something he'd avoided since returning from overseas. Elena's fierce protection of her daughters, Carmen's mature wisdom, Sophia's resilient spirit, they'd reminded him of connections he'd thought were lost forever. "Mr. Chun," Janet was saying, pulling him from his thoughts, "we'll need you to walk the jury through the medical assessment you performed on Sophia. Your military medic background gives your observations particular weight." Marcus nodded. "She was in the early stages of heat stroke when I found them. Without intervention, she could have suffered organ failure within hours." Sophia looked up from her coloring book at the mention of her name. Her recovery had been complete, but she still stayed close to her mother and sister whenever possible. The trauma of their ordeal would take time to heal completely. "The defense is going to argue that Davidson was merely a businessman who got in over his head," Janet continued. "They'll claim he never intended to harm anyone, that tying your family to that fence was the work of subordinates acting without his knowledge." Elena's expression hardened. "Davidson personally threatened my daughters. He knew exactly what his men were doing." Through the courthouse windows, Marcus could see monsoon clouds building again on the horizon. The summer storm season was in full swing, and the desert was greener than it had been in years. Life found a way to flourish even in the harshest conditions. Carmen set down her crayon and looked directly at Janet. "Will we have to live somewhere else after the trial?" she asked. "In witness protection or something like that?" It was a question that had been weighing on all their minds. Davidson's network extended far beyond the individuals who had been arrested at the gas station. Federal investigators had uncovered connections to cartels, corrupt officials, and criminal organizations across 3 states. "We're still evaluating the threat level," Janet replied carefully. "Your safety is our primary concern." Elena reached over and smoothed Carmen's hair. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together. That's what families do." The simple statement carried weight that went beyond the immediate circumstances. Marcus found himself thinking about his own family, parents he rarely called, siblings scattered across the country, relationships he'd let wither after his military service. A federal agent appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Valdez, we're ready for the pre-trial walkthrough." As Elena rose to follow the agent, she turned to Marcus. "Would you mind staying with the girls for a few minutes? This part might be difficult for them to hear." Marcus found himself alone with Sophia and Carmen, watching them return to their coloring with the focused intensity that children brought to simple tasks. He'd grown fond of these sessions, partly because they reminded him of the medical training he'd done with local communities during his deployments. "Mr. Marcus," Sophia said suddenly, "my mama says you saved our lives." Carmen looked up from her drawing, a surprisingly detailed sketch of the desert landscape around the gas station. "She says you didn't have to stop, but you did anyway." Marcus struggled with how to respond. The girls had been through trauma that would challenge adults, yet they spoke about their experience with a matter-of-fact acceptance that humbled him. "Sometimes you just do what needs to be done," he said finally. "Your mother and sister would have done the same thing for someone else. Mama says you're like Papa was," Sophia continued. "He always helped people too." The comparison to Roberto, whom Marcus had never met but whose presence still filled their conversations, was both touching and sobering. Elena often spoke about her husband's generosity, his willingness to help neighbors and strangers alike. It was that same generous spirit that had made her vulnerable to Davidson's manipulation. Carmen finished shading a saguaro cactus in her drawing and held it up for Marcus to see. "This is where you found us," she said. "But I drew flowers growing." Around the fence, Marcus studied the picture. Carmen had indeed added blooming Palo Verde trees and desert wildflowers to what had been a scene of terror and desperation. In her artistic interpretation, life and beauty had reclaimed the place where they'd almost died. "It's beautiful," Marcus said, and meant it. Elena returned an hour later, looking drained but determined. The pretrial process was grueling, forcing her to relive every detail of her family's ordeal. But each session also seemed to strengthen her resolve to see justice done. "How did it go?" Marcus asked. "They showed me photographs of all the weapons they recovered from Davidson's other storage sites," Elena replied. "Enough firearms to equip a small army, if we hadn't escaped when we did ... She didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood. The weapons trafficking operation had been vast, with Elena's garage serving as just one link in a chain that stretched from Mexico to Canada. Her decision to back out had threatened the entire network. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Sophia tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Are you coming to dinner tonight?" she asked. "Mama's making tamales." The dinner invitation had become a regular occurrence over the past 3 weeks. Elena insisted it was her way of thanking Marcus for his help, but he suspected there was more to it than gratitude. The Valdez family had a way of drawing people into their circle, making them feel part of something larger than themselves. "I wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied. That evening, Marcus found himself in Elena's kitchen, helping to prepare masa while Sophia and Carmen set the table. The house was modest but filled with warmth, family photographs, children's artwork, and the lingering aromas of Elena's cooking. "The prosecutor thinks we have a strong case," Elena said as she seasoned the pork filling. "Davidson's lawyers are already talking about plea deals." Marcus had been following the investigation through his contacts at the FBI. Davidson's network had been more extensive than anyone initially realized, with connections to legitimate businesses, corrupt officials, and international smuggling. "Operations, what happens to your house?" Marcus asked. "The one where they stored the weapons?" Elena's expression darkened slightly. "It's still considered a crime scene. The FBI says it could be months before I can move back. Even then, I'm not sure I'd want to." Carmen looked up from folding napkins. "Too many bad memories," she said with the wisdom of someone far older than her 14 years. "But we're not just running away," Elena added quickly. "We're choosing to start fresh somewhere that feels safe." Sophia emerged from the kitchen carrying a pitcher of agua fresca. "Mr. Marcus, do you have a family?" The question was innocent but pointed. Marcus had deflected similar inquiries over the years, preferring to keep his personal life separate from his professional relationships. But something about the directness of Sophia's question, combined with the domestic warmth of the scene around him, made evasion seem pointless. "I have parents and 2 sisters," he said. "But I don't see them very often." "Why not?" Carmen asked with the fearless curiosity of youth. Marcus found himself explaining things he'd never articulated before: how military service had changed him, how civilian relationships had become difficult to maintain, how he'd grown comfortable with solitude and self-reliance. Elena listened without judgment as she worked. "Roberto was like that when he came back from Iraq," she said eventually. "He said it was hard to care about normal problems when you'd seen people die for no reason. How did he get past it?" Marcus asked. Elena smiled, her hands never pausing. "In their work. He decided that creating something good was more important than protecting himself from being hurt. We got married 6 months after he came home." As if summoned by the mention of their father, both girls began sharing stories about Roberto, his terrible jokes, his weekend construction projects, his insistence on teaching them basic car maintenance, even though Carmen was only 10 at the time. Marcus found himself laughing at their descriptions, feeling a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The Valdez family had a gift for making even painful memories feel like celebrations of love rather than monuments to loss. After dinner, as Marcus helped clear the dishes, Elena pulled him aside. "The FBI victim coordinator talked to me about relocation assistance," she said quietly. "They're offering to help us start over in a different state. Are you going to accept?" Elena glanced toward the living room, where Sophia and Carmen were teaching each other card games. "The girls have been through enough disruption. They need stability, routine, people they can count on." Marcus understood the implication. Elena was asking, without asking, whether he would be part of their new life wherever it led them. The question should have terrified him. For years he'd avoided exactly this kind of emotional entanglement. But looking at Sophia and Carmen, remembering Elena's courage under impossible circumstances, Marcus realized that some connections were worth the risk. "Where are you thinking of going?" he asked. Elena's smile was radiant. "Somewhere with good schools and honest work, maybe Colorado. The girls have never seen snow." 3 months later, Marcus drove his medical supply truck through the mountains outside Denver, delivering equipment to a rural clinic that served farming communities in the valley. The route was different from his old runs through the Arizona desert, but the work was essentially the same. The difference was that now, at the end of each day, he had somewhere to go that felt like home. Elena had found work as a translator for the county health department, using her bilingual skills to help other immigrant families navigate complex medical and social services. Carmen had thrown herself into her new school with typical intensity, already talking about colleges and career plans. Sophia had discovered a love for art, filling sketchbooks with drawings of their new mountain landscape. They lived in a small house with a view of the Rockies, its windows always open to let in the sound of wind through pine trees. It was nothing like the desert landscape where their story had begun, but it felt like the place where their real life was starting. On weekends, Marcus would help the girls with homework, teach them basic medical skills, and listen to Elena's plans for expanding her translation services into a nonprofit organization. They were building something together, not just a household, but a family chosen rather than inherited. Sometimes late at night, Marcus would think about that Tuesday morning when he'd first seen 3 figures tied to a fence in the Arizona desert. He'd stopped because it was the right thing to do, never imagining that saving their lives would end up saving his own. The trial had ended with Davidson receiving a 25-year federal sentence. His network had been dismantled, weapons had been recovered, and other families had been freed from similar coercion. Justice had been served. But more importantly, healing had begun. Elena kept Carmen's drawing of the desert fence surrounded by flowers on their new refrigerator. It served as a reminder that even in the harshest places, with enough courage and care, beautiful things could grow. And they had. 2 years had passed since the courthouse hearings in Phoenix, and Marcus barely recognized the confident young woman who strode across the stage to accept her high school valedictorian award. Carmen Valdez had not only adapted to their new life in Colorado, but had excelled beyond anyone's expectations, earning a full scholarship to the University of Colorado's pre-med program. Marcus sat in the auditorium between Alana and Sophia, watching with the kind of pride he imagined fathers felt at moments like these. The girl who had once whispered warnings about dangerous men while tied to a desert fence was now delivering a graduation speech about resilience and the power of second chances. Education, Carmen was saying from the podium, is not just about accumulating knowledge. It's about transforming that knowledge into action that helps others. 2 years ago, my family learned that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is the chance to start over. Sophia, now 13 and taller than her mother, leaned over to whisper, "She's talking about you, Mr. Marcus." Elena reached across and squeezed Marcus's hand. They'd been married for 8 months now, a quiet ceremony in their backyard with just Sophia, Carmen, and a few close friends in attendance. The transition from rescued stranger to family friend to something deeper had happened so gradually that Marcus could barely identify when his feelings had changed. What he did know was that Elena's strength had inspired him to confront parts of himself he'd kept buried since his military service. With her encouragement, he'd started attending therapy sessions with a counselor who specializes in helping veterans readjust to civilian life. The work was difficult, but it had allowed him to build bridges back to his own family that he'd thought were permanently burned out. After the graduation ceremony, they gathered at the local diner where Carmen had worked part-time throughout her senior year. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, had decorated a corner booth with balloons and a congratulatory banner. It was the kind of small-town gesture that had helped the Valdez family feel truly welcomed in their new community. "So what's the plan for the summer?" Mrs. Patterson asked as she brought over a celebratory cake. "Before you head off to conquer the medical world?" Carmen grinned and looked at her family. "Actually, we have a project we're working on together." Over the past year, Elena's translation services had evolved into something much larger. What had started as helping individual families navigate healthcare and social services had grown into a nonprofit organization called New Horizons Community Support. They provided translation services, legal advocacy, and crisis intervention for immigrant families throughout the region. But their most ambitious project was still in the planning stages: a residential facility for women and children escaping dangerous situations. Elena had seen too many families trapped in cycles of abuse, exploitation, and poverty because they had nowhere safe to go and no resources to start over. "The county approved our application for the old Miller farm," Elena announced, unable to contain her excitement any longer. 15 acres, existing buildings that can be renovated, and enough space for up to 20 families at a time. Marcus had been working with Elena on the proposal for months, using his medical background to design a facility that could provide both emergency shelter and long-term transitional housing. Carmen and Sophia had contributed by researching similar programs in other states and developing educational components for children who might have missed significant amounts of schooling. "It's going to be called Esperanza Haven," Sophia added. "Hope Haven in English." Mrs. Patterson clasped her hands together. "That's wonderful. This community needs something like that. How can we help?" The question sparked a conversation that lasted well into the evening. By the time they left the diner, Carmen had recruited 3 volunteers for their summer construction crew. Elena had commitments for donated materials, and Sophia had scheduled a meeting with the local library to discuss educational programming. Driving home through the mountain darkness, Marcus reflected on how different his life had become. 2 years ago, He'd been a solitary man driving medical supplies through empty desert, avoiding meaningful connections with other people. Now he was part of a family that seemed determined to make their corner of the world a better place. "Penny for your thoughts," Elena said from the passenger seat. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Marcus replied. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't seen you that morning." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Someone else would have found us eventually. But I think we needed to find you as much as you needed to find us." In the back seat, Carmen was already making lists for their summer renovation project, while Sophia dozed against the window. The energy in the car was infectious, the kind of excitement that came from having meaningful work to do and people to do it with. The next morning, Marcus drove out to the Miller farm with Elena to survey the property more thoroughly. The main house was a solid Victorian structure built in the 1890s, with enough bedrooms to house multiple families. The outbuildings included a large barn that could be converted into community space and several smaller structures that might serve as offices or workshops. "The inspector says the foundation is sound," Elena said, consulting the thick folder of documents they'd accumulated during the approval process. "Most of the work will be cosmetic painting, updating plumbing and electrical, making it accessible for people with disabilities." Marcus walked through the main house, mentally cataloging the work that would need to be done. His construction skills were limited, but he'd learned enough during his military service to understand the scope of the project. It was ambitious but achievable, especially with community support. "The timing is good," he said. "Carmen can spend the summer working on the renovation before she starts college. It'll give her practical experience to go with all that theoretical knowledge." Elena smiled as she tested a light switch in what would become the main kitchen. "She's already talking about doing her senior project on rural healthcare delivery. I think this place is going to be part of her research." Over the following weeks, the renovation project became a community effort that surprised even Elena with its scope. Carmen organized her high school classmates into work crews, with different groups tackling painting, landscaping, and basic repairs. Sophia appointed herself project photographer, documenting the transformation with the artistic eye she'd developed since their move to Colorado. Marcus found himself serving as an unofficial project manager, coordinating between the volunteers, the professional contractors handling electrical and plumbing work, and the various agencies providing funding and oversight. It was challenging work, but it felt purposeful in a way his previous job had not. The breakthrough moment came on. Sweltering July afternoon when they were struggling to install new windows in the main house. Marcus was on a ladder, wrestling with a frame that seemed determined not to fit properly, when a voice called out from below. "Need some help up there?" Marcus looked down to see a man in his 50s wearing work clothes and a familiar expression of amused competence. "I'm Bill Henderson," the man continued. "I own the hardware store in town. Heard you folks might need some extra hands." Within an hour, Bill had recruited 2 other local contractors who donated their afternoon to the project. By evening, all the windows were installed and properly sealed. More importantly, word was spreading through the community about Esperanza Haven and the work being done there. "People want to help," Bill explained as they cleaned up for the day. "They just need to know how." Elena had suspected this was true, but seeing it in action was still remarkable. Over the next month, donations poured in: furniture from families who were downsizing, professional services from accountants and lawyers, even a small grant from the State Community Development Fund. Carmen threw herself into the project with the intensity she brought to everything, working 12-hour days and researching best practices for residential facilities. She interviewed social workers, studied trauma-informed care protocols, and developed intake procedures that would help families transition from crisis to stability. "I want my first year of college to mean something," she explained to Marcus. One evening as they painted trim in what would become the children's playroom. "This work feels more important than just getting good grades." Sophia had her own role in the project, designing art therapy spaces and organizing the children's areas. Her experience with trauma had given her insights into what young people needed to feel safe and supported. She was particularly excited about the small greenhouse they were building, where residents could grow their own food and flowers. By late August, Esperanza Haven was ready to welcome its first families. The main house gleamed with fresh paint and new furnishings. The grounds had been landscaped with gardens and play areas. Most importantly, Elena had assembled a staff of trained advocates and counselors who understood the complex needs of families escaping dangerous situations. The grand opening was scheduled for a Saturday in early September, just before Carmen left for college. Local officials would attend, along with representatives from the organizations that had supported the project. But for Marcus, the most meaningful moment came the evening before, when he found Elena standing alone in the main living room of the facility. Having second thoughts? He asked gently. Elena shook her head. Just thinking about all the families who will find safety here. Children who will have a chance to be children again. Women who will discover they're stronger than they ever imagined. Marcus joined her in the center of the room, looking around at what they'd accomplished together. The space was warm and welcoming, furnished with comfortable seating and decorated with Sophia's artwork. It felt like a place where healing could happen. Roberto would be proud of you, Marcus said. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. He would be proud of all of us. This is what he always talked about, using whatever you have to make things better for other people. The next morning, Esperanza Haven officially opened its doors. The first family to arrive was a young mother with 2 small children who had fled an abusive situation in New Mexico. Elena personally welcomed them, showing them to their temporary home and explaining the services available to help them rebuild their lives. Marcus watched from the kitchen window as Carmen helped the children explore the playground while Sophia showed the mother the greenhouse and garden areas. It was a scene that captured everything they'd been working toward: safety, hope, and the possibility of new beginnings. Later that afternoon, after the ceremonies and tours were complete, Marcus found himself alone with Elena on the front porch of the facility. Carmen had left for college that morning, armed with contact information for professors researching rural healthcare and a promise to return for Thanksgiving. So what's next? Marcus asked. Elena leaned against his shoulder, watching the sun set. Over the mountains, we keep growing. The state is interested in funding 2 more facilities like this one. There's talk of expanding into job training programs and educational support. Marcus nodded, thinking about the work ahead. It would be challenging, requiring the same kind of persistence and courage that had brought them this far. But he was no longer the isolated man who had once driven empty highways to avoid meaningful connections. Whatever comes next, he said, we'll face it together. As if summoned by his words, Sophia appeared on the porch with her camera, documenting the end of their first day. In her photographs, Marcus knew this moment would be preserved as another milestone in a story that had begun with desperation and fear, but had evolved into something much more powerful. They were no longer just survivors. They had become builders of hope, creating safe spaces where other families could discover their own strength and begin their own journeys toward healing. The work would continue, and their family would keep growing in ways they couldn't yet imagine. 5 years after Esperanza Haven opened its doors, Marcus stood in the lobby of the Colorado State Capitol building, adjusting his tie and reviewing the speech notes Elena had helped him prepare. In 30 minutes, he would address a legislative committee considering a bill to expand funding for family crisis facilities across the state. The nervous energy in his stomach reminded him of the anxiety he'd felt before military briefings. But this time the stakes felt even higher. Dr. Valdez will see you now, a legislative aide announced, gesturing toward a conference room where Elena was finishing her own presentation to a subcommittee on healthcare access. The title still made Marcus smile. Elena had completed her master's degree in social work 2 years earlier, writing her thesis on trauma-informed care for immigrant families. Her work had become required reading in several university programs, and she was increasingly invited to speak at conferences across the country. How did it go? Marcus asked as Elena emerged from the conference room, gathering her materials. Better than expected, she replied, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders. 3 of the 5 committee members seemed genuinely interested in expanding the program. The other 2 are more concerned about budget implications. Marcus understood the challenge. Esperanza Haven had been operating at capacity for 3 years, with a waiting list that sometimes stretched to 6 months. They'd opened 2 additional facilities in other parts of Colorado, but demand continued to outpace their ability to provide services. Mr. Chun? A young woman approached with a clipboard and an official-looking badge. I'm Sarah Kim, legislative researcher. The committee is ready for your presentation. Marcus followed her into a formal hearing room where 5 legislators sat behind a curved desk, looking down at him with expressions ranging from polite interest to outright skepticism. He'd learned to read these rooms over the years, identifying potential allies and opponents within the first few minutes. Mr. Chun, the committee chair began, you've been involved with crisis residential facilities for several years now. In your opinion, what makes these programs effective? Marcus had given versions of this presentation dozens of times, but he never used the same script twice. Each audience required a different approach, and these legislators needed to understand both the human impact and the economic benefits of the work. 5 years ago, Marcus began, I encountered a family that had been terrorized by criminals and left to die in the desert. Today, the mother of that family holds a doctorate and runs programs that have helped over 300 families rebuild their lives. Her older daughter is in medical school, and her younger daughter just won a statewide art competition. He could see he had their attention now. Personal stories always resonated more than statistics, though he had plenty of those prepared as well. But the real measure of success isn't just what happened to one family, Marcus continued. It's what those families go on to accomplish. 78% of the adults who complete our program find stable employment within 6 months. 85% of the children return to regular school attendance. Most importantly, less than 5% of families require crisis intervention again within 5 years. The questions that followed were thorough and occasionally challenging. Marcus fielded inquiries about cost effectiveness, recidivism rates, and the potential for program expansion. He'd anticipated most of them, drawing on years of data collection and evaluation that Elena had insisted on from the beginning. What about screening? Asked Representative Walsh, a stern woman who had been taking extensive notes. How do you prevent these facilities from being exploited by people who don't genuinely need help? It was a question that revealed underlying assumptions about poverty and desperation, but Marcus had learned to address such concerns directly. Our intake process is comprehensive, he explained. We work with law enforcement, social services, and healthcare providers to verify need. But I'd suggest that the bigger risk is turning away families who do need help because we're afraid of helping someone who doesn't. After the hearing, Marcus and Elena met Sophia for lunch at a downtown cafe. Now 18 and preparing for her first year at the Colorado Institute of Art, Sophia had grown into a confident young woman whose trauma-informed perspective influenced her artistic work. Her recent exhibition, Invisible Chains, had explored themes of captivity and liberation through mixed media installations. How did the politicians react? Sophia asked as she sketched in the margins of her menu a habit she'd developed years earlier that had evolved into a constant practice of observing and documenting the world around her. Mixed reactions, Elena replied. But I think we made progress. The key is finding champions who will push the legislation forward even when we're not in the room. Marcus was studying Sophia's sketch, which somehow managed to capture the energy of the busy cafe in just a few quick lines. "Have you decided on your major yet?" he asked. Sophia grinned. "Art therapy with a minor in social work. I want to combine what I love with what I've learned about helping people heal." It was a choice that reflected the values their family had developed over the years, the belief that everyone had something valuable to contribute, and that the most meaningful work involved helping others discover their own strength. Their conversation was interrupted by Elena's phone buzzing with an urgent message. She read it quickly, her expression shifting from casual interest to serious concern. "What is it?" Marcus asked. "There's been an incident at the Pueblo facility," Elena said, already standing and gathering her things. "A woman arrived this morning with 3 children, claiming they're being hunted by a trafficking ring. Local police want to involve federal agents." Marcus felt a familiar chill. Despite the years that had passed, cases involving human trafficking still triggered memories of their own experience with Davidson's network. The difference now was that they had resources and knowledge to help in ways that hadn't been available to them in the beginning. "I'm coming with you," Sophia announced, closing her sketchbook. Elena started to protest, but Sophia cut her off. "Mom, I'm 18, and I've been working with trafficking survivors for 2 years. I can help." The drive to Pueblo took 90 minutes, during which Elena coordinated with the facility director and federal agents, while Marcus navigated through mountain traffic. Sophia sat in the back seat, reading case files on her tablet and making notes about art therapy techniques that might be appropriate for traumatized children. The Pueblo facility was their newest and largest, housed in a renovated resort that could accommodate up to 40 families. Unlike the intimate setting of the original Esperanza Haven, this facility was designed to handle complex cases that required specialized services. "The family arrived around 6 this morning," explained Director Martinez as they walked through the facility's security entrance. The mother, Angela Santos, claimed she was forced into labor trafficking in Nevada. She escaped with her children, but says the traffickers are still looking for them. Marcus recognized the signs immediately, the hypervigilance, the way Angela positioned herself between her children and any potential threat, the exhaustion that came from weeks or months of constant fear. Her 3 children, ranging in age from about 6 to 12, stayed close to their mother with the practiced silence of kids who had learned that visibility could be dangerous. "Mrs. Santos," Elena said gently as they approached the family, "I'm Elena Chun. This is my husband Marcus and our daughter Sophia. We run the program here." Angela's eyes darted between them, assessing threat levels and escape routes. "The police said you could help," she said in accented English. "But they also said men have been asking questions in town, looking for a woman with 3 children. Sophia knelt down to the children's eye level, pulling out a small sketch pad and colored pencils. Without saying anything, she began drawing simple flowers and animals, offering the pencils to the youngest child with a shy smile. It was a technique she'd developed for approaching traumatized children, art as a universal language that didn't require trust or verbal communication. "Can you tell us what happened?" Marcus asked Angela while Elena reviewed the intake paperwork. The story that emerged was horrifyingly familiar, yet uniquely personal. Angela had been recruited for what she thought was domestic work in Las Vegas, only to discover that she and her children were being held in debt bondage by a criminal organization. The debt for their transportation and housing kept growing, making freedom impossible through legitimate means. "I waited until they took my oldest son to work in their warehouse," Angela explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then I grabbed the little ones and ran. We hitchhiked, walked, hid in churches. It took us 3 weeks to get here." Elena was already making phone calls to federal contacts while Marcus assessed the children for signs of physical abuse or medical neglect. The youngest, a girl named Isabella, had accepted Sophia's colored pencils and was carefully adding details to one of the flower drawings. "The FBI task force is sending someone down from Denver," Elena reported. "But they won't be here until tomorrow morning. We need to assume the traffickers are still tracking this family." The next several hours involved implementing security protocols that had been developed over years of handling high-risk cases. The facility went into partial lockdown, with increased screening for visitors and coordination with local law enforcement. Angela and her children were moved to a secure wing where they could be monitored and protected while their case was being investigated. "This never gets easier," Elena confided to Marcus as they reviewed security footage from the morning. "Every time I think we've seen the worst of what people can do to each other, something like this happens." Marcus nodded, remembering their own desperate morning tied to a fence in the Arizona desert. "But look at what Angela accomplished," he said. "She found a way to save her children from an impossible situation. That takes incredible strength." Sophia emerged from the children's area with a stack of drawings that Isabella and her brothers had created during their art session. The pictures showed houses with strong walls, families holding hands, and flowers growing in impossible places. Universal symbols of safety and hope that traumatized children drew when they began to believe that protection might be possible. "They're going to be okay," Sophia announced with the confidence of someone who had walked a similar path. "It'll take time, but they're fighters. You can see it in their art." The federal agents arrived the next morning with news that validated Angela's fears. The trafficking ring she'd escaped from was part of a larger network that operated across multiple states, with connections to the same criminal organizations that had once threatened the Valdez family. "We've been tracking this group for 18 months, Agent Rebecca Foster explained during a briefing with the facility staff. "Mrs. Santos is the first victim who's been willing to cooperate with our investigation. Her testimony could help. U.S. shut down the entire operation. But cooperation came with risks. Angela would need to enter witness protection with her children, starting over in a new location with new identities. It was a chance for freedom, but it also meant leaving behind any remaining connections to their previous life. I've lost everything already," Angela told Elena during a private conversation. "My home, my job, my family in Mexico. What's one more new beginning if it means my children will be safe?" The decision to enter witness protection was made over the course of several days, with extensive consultation between federal agents, victim advocates, and psychologists. Throughout the process, Sophia worked with Angela's children using art therapy to help them process their trauma and prepare for another major transition. "The amazing thing," Sophia explained to Marcus one evening, "is how resilient kids can be when they know adults are fighting to protect them. These children have been through hell, but they're already starting to imagine futures where they can be normal kids again." On Angela's last day at the facility, she asked to speak privately with Elena, Marcus, and Sophia. Her transformation over the past week had been remarkable, from a terrified woman constantly looking over her shoulder to someone who stood straighter and spoke with growing confidence. "I want to do what you've done," Angela told them. "After the trial, after we're settled somewhere new, I want to help other families who are trapped the way we were. Will you teach me?" Elena's response was immediate. "Of course. And you don't have to wait until after the trial. There are things you can do now, ways to help while you're still healing." As Angela and her children left with their federal escorts, Sophia added their drawings to a collection she'd been maintaining for years, artwork created by the children who had found safety at their facilities. The collection had grown to include hundreds of pieces, each one representing a family that had found the courage to start over. "I want to use these in my senior project," Sophia told her parents as they drove back to Denver. An exhibition about resilience and recovery, showing how art can be both a record of trauma and a tool for healing. Marcus looked at his daughter. In the rearview mirror, this young woman who had survived her own nightmare and was now committed to helping others survive theirs. The scared 11-year-old he'd found tied to a desert fence had grown into someone whose compassion was matched by her determination to make the world better. "Your project sounds perfect," he said, "but I think it should be more than just an exhibition. Maybe it's time to write a book about all of this, the families we've helped, the lessons we've learned, the ways that people can find strength they never knew they had." Elena reached over and squeezed his hand. "A book about second chances," she said, "and the people who make them possible." That night, as Marcus reviewed the notes from the legislative hearing and Elena prepared for another policy meeting, Sophia sat at her desk working on preliminary sketches for her senior project. The three of them were planning their next steps in the ongoing work of building hope from the wreckage of trauma. Outside their window, snow was beginning to fall over the Colorado mountains, covering the landscape in a blanket of white that would melt in the spring to feed new growth. It was a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life found ways to endure and flourish. Their work would continue, expanding to help more families and influencing policy at state and national levels. But the foundation would always be the same: the belief that everyone deserved safety, dignity, and the chance to build something beautiful from whatever pieces remained of their lives. 10 years had passed since Marcus first spotted 3 figures bound to a desert fence, and today he found himself standing in the rose garden of the White House, wearing a suit that Elena had insisted he buy specifically for this occasion. The President's Award for Exceptional Service to American Communities was not something he'd ever imagined receiving, but then again, his entire life had taken directions he'd never imagined possible. Dr. Elena Chun and Mr. Marcus Chun, the White House Protocol Officer, announced, founders of the Esperanza Network, which has provided crisis intervention services to over 1,500 families across 7 states. Marcus felt Elena's hand squeeze his as they stepped forward to meet the president. Behind them in the assembled crowd, he could see Carmen in her medical residency scrubs she'd driven straight from the hospital after finishing a 36-hour shift, and Sophia, now a graduate student at Yale whose thesis on art therapy for trafficking survivors had been published in 3 academic journals. "Your work represents the very best of American values," the president said as she presented them with the award. "When you see a family in crisis, you don't ask about their documentation status or their ability to pay. You ask how you can help. That's the kind of leadership our country needs." The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with remarks from several other community leaders who had been recognized for their service. Marcus found himself thinking about all the people who weren't in this formal garden, the mothers who had found safety at their facilities, the children who were now thriving in school, the volunteers who had given countless hours to make their work possible. After the formal presentations, they gathered in a smaller reception room where Marcus was surprised to see a familiar face. Approaching through the crowd, Agent Rebecca Foster, now promoted to Deputy Director of the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force, had been instrumental in dismantling the network that had threatened Angela Santos's family years earlier. "Congratulations," Agent Foster said, shaking hands with both Elena and Marcus. "Your facilities have become an essential part of our recovery operations. We've placed 43 families through your network in the past 2 years alone." Elena smiled, but Marcus could see the weight of responsibility in her expression. Each of those families represented a success story, but also a reminder of how much work remained to be done. "How is Angela doing?" Sophia asked, joining their conversation. She'd maintained contact with many of the families they'd helped over the years, often serving as an informal mentor for children who were struggling with their own recovery. "Remarkably well," Agent Foster replied. "She completed her social work degree last year and is now running a program in Oregon that specifically helps Latino families escape trafficking situations. Her oldest son just started college on a full scholarship." It was the kind of update that made all their work worthwhile proof, that healing was possible, and that survivors could become leaders in their own right. Marcus had learned over the years that the most powerful advocates were often people who had lived through the experiences they were trying to address. "Speaking of Angela," Alina said, "she's actually flying in tomorrow for the board meeting. We're announcing the expansion into Texas and California." The Esperanza network had grown far beyond what any of them had initially envisioned. What had started as a single facility in rural Colorado now included residential programs, job training centers, legal advocacy services, and policy research initiatives across multiple states. Carmen had contributed by establishing medical clinics at several facilities, ensuring that families had access to trauma-informed health care. "I have some news that might interest you," Agent Foster continued. "We've identified the location of Davidson's operation from your original case. He's been running a trafficking network from federal prison, coordinating with associates on the outside. We're planning a coordinated raid next month." Marcus felt Alina tense beside him. Davidson's name still had the power to bring back memories of that morning in the desert, even after all these years. The man who had terrorized Elena's family represented a kind of evil that never seemed to disappear completely. "Will this affect any of our current families?" Alina asked with the practical concern of someone who had learned to think first about protecting the people in her care. "We don't believe so," Agent Foster assured her. "But we wanted you to know in case any former victims reach out. Sometimes arrests trigger memories and fears in people who thought they were safe." After the reception, the family returned to their hotel suite overlooking the Potomac River. Carmen had changed out of her scrubs into a dress that Sophia had helped her pick out, and for the first time in weeks, they were all together without the pressure of work obligations or urgent crises. "I still can't believe we were at the White House," Carmen said, examining the award that Alina had placed on the coffee table. "Remember when our biggest concern was whether we'd have enough money for groceries?" Sophia was sketching in her ever-present notebook, capturing details from the ceremony that she would later incorporate into her art. "I want to create something for the new facilities," she said. "A series of installations that show the journey from crisis to stability to leadership." Elena was reading messages on her phone from colleagues who had watched the ceremony online. The recognition was gratifying, but Marcus could see that she was already thinking about how to use the increased visibility to advance their work. "The documentary crew wants to film at the original facility next week," Elena announced. "They're particularly interested in interviewing long-term survivors who are now working in the field." The documentary was a project that Sophia had initiated as part of her graduate work, but it had evolved into something much larger. Major networks were interested in airing it, and there was talk of developing it into a series that would follow multiple families through their recovery journeys. "Are you comfortable being on camera?" Marcus asked Elena. Despite her public speaking and policy work, she had always been protective of their family's privacy. "If it helps other families find the courage to leave dangerous situations, then yes," Elena replied. "Our story stopped being just about us a long time ago." That evening, they had dinner at a restaurant that Carmen had discovered during her medical school interviews in Washington. The conversation ranged from Sophia's upcoming gallery exhibition to Carmen's plans for a fellowship in emergency medicine, with particular focus on treating trafficking victims. "I've been thinking about something," Carmen said as they waited. "For dessert, what if we established a scholarship program specifically for survivors who want to enter healthcare or social work? People like Angela who want to turn their experiences into tools for helping others." It was exactly the kind of innovation that had driven their organization's growth over the years, identifying needs and developing creative solutions. Marcus made a mental note to discuss the idea with their board of directors. "We could partner with universities that already have strong social work programs," Elena added, her strategic mind already working through the logistics. "Provide not just financial support, but also mentoring and practical experience. Sophia looked up from her sketching, and we could document the scholarship recipients' journeys through art and storytelling. Show people that survival is just the beginning. What matters is what you build afterward. The next morning brought them back to Colorado and the reality of running a complex organization with multiple facilities and hundreds of staff members. The board meeting that Alina had mentioned was scheduled for that afternoon, with representatives from all 7 states where they now operated programs. Marcus arrived early at their Denver headquarters, a converted warehouse that housed administrative offices, training facilities, and a resource center for families who had completed residential programs. The building buzzed with activity case managers coordinating with field offices, researchers analyzing program outcomes, volunteers preparing materials for new facility openings. Marcus, a voice called from across the main work area. He turned to see Dr. James Restrepo, a psychologist who had joined their team 3 years earlier after completing groundbreaking research on trauma recovery in children. The preliminary results from the longitudinal study are remarkable. Dr. Restrepo continued as he approached with a thick folder of charts and graphs. Children who complete our program show resilience markers that are actually higher than national averages for kids who have never experienced trauma. It was validation of something they had observed anecdotally for years, that children who survived extreme adversity and received appropriate support often developed exceptional emotional strength and empathy. Sophia was a perfect example, having channeled her own experience into artistic work that helped other young survivors. The board meeting convened at 2:00 with representatives participating both in person and via video conference from facilities across the country. Angela Santos joined from Oregon, her transformation from desperate trafficking victim to confident program director serving as inspiration for everyone in the room. The demand continues to outpace our capacity, Elena reported, reviewing statistics that told a sobering story. We're operating at full capacity in all 7 states, with waiting lists that average 4 to 6 months. The expansion into Texas and California will help, but we need to think more systematically about scaling our model. Marcus listened as board members discussed strategies for growth, partnerships with existing social service agencies, training programs for other organizations, policy initiatives that would increase government funding for victim services. The conversation was sophisticated and strategic, reflecting how much their organization had evolved from its grassroots origins. "I want to add something to our discussion," Angela said from the video screen. "Last month, I was contacted by advocates in Central America who want to establish similar programs in Guatemala and Honduras. They're dealing with internal trafficking networks that force families to migrate north, often into even worse situations." The room fell silent as board members considered the implications. International expansion would represent a completely new level of complexity, but the need was undeniable. We'd need partnerships with established organizations in those countries, Elena said thoughtfully. People who understand the local context and can navigate political challenges we don't have experience with. Sophia, who had been invited to observe the board meeting as part of her research, spoke up from the back of the room. "What if we started with training and consultation rather than direct service provision? Share our model and support local organizations in adapting it to their communities." It was a wise suggestion that reflected lessons learned from their domestic expansion. The most successful facilities had been those where local communities took ownership of the programs, rather than simply implementing a model developed elsewhere. As the meeting concluded, Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. 10 years ago, he had been a solitary man whose only connections were professional and temporary. Today, he was part of a family and an organization that spanned multiple states and was considering international impact. But the core mission remained the same, ensuring that families in crisis had access to safety, dignity, and the chance to rebuild their lives. Whether they were tied to a fence in the Arizona desert or trapped in a trafficking operation in Nevada, people deserve to be seen, heard, and helped. That evening, Marcus and Alina walked through the original Esperanza Haven facility, now their flagship program that served as a training center for staff from other locations. The buildings that they had renovated with volunteer labor 10 years earlier had been expanded and updated, but the fundamental atmosphere of safety and hope remained unchanged. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that morning? Elena asked as they stood in the main living room where so many families had taken their first steps toward recovery. Marcus considered the question seriously. "I think someone else would have found you eventually," he said, "but I'm grateful it was me. Not just because of what we've built together, but because you taught me that saving other people is really just another way of saving yourself." Elena smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "Tomorrow we start planning the International Consultation Program. Next month we will open 2 new facilities. Next year we'll probably be dealing with challenges we can't even imagine yet. And we'll figure it out as we go," Marcus replied, "the way we always have." Outside the window, Sophia was leading an art therapy session with a group of children who had arrived at the facility just that week. Their laughter carried across the evening air, a sound that had become the soundtrack of their work, the music of healing, hope, and new beginnings that never grew old. 15 years after that life-changing morning in the Arizona desert, Marcus stood in the departure lounge of Denver International Airport, watching Elena adjust her laptop bag one final time before their flight to Guatemala City. At 63, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate complex international negotiations. But Marcus could still see traces of the nervous energy that had always preceded their most ambitious projects. The Ministry of Social Development confirmed the meeting for Thursday, Elena said, reviewing her tablet schedule. "And Dr. Morales from the Universidad de San Carlos wants to discuss establishing a formal partnership for training social workers." Their International Consultation Program had evolved far beyond what anyone had initially envisioned. Over the past 5 years, they had provided training and technical assistance to organizations in 12 countries, adapting their crisis intervention model to different cultural contexts and legal systems. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding, especially when they received updates about families who had been helped by programs they had influenced. Carmen appeared at the gate, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the practical travel clothes she'd adopted for these international trips. Now 32 and serving as Chief Medical Officer for the Esperanza Network, she had taken a leave of absence from her position at Denver General to focus on developing healthcare protocols for trafficking survivors worldwide, Sophia texted. From the plane, Carmen announced as she handed coffee to her parents. Her documentary crew landed in Guatemala City 2 hours ago. They're already setting up interviews with families who went through the pilot program. Sophia's documentary series had premiered on Netflix the previous year to critical acclaim and significant public impact. Invisible Chains, Stories of Survival and Hope, had been viewed by over 50 million people worldwide, generating donations, volunteer applications, and policy changes in multiple countries. More importantly, it had inspired trafficking survivors to come forward and seek help, knowing that recovery was possible. "I still can't believe she convinced the streaming service to fund a follow-up series," Marcus said, shaking his head in amazement at his daughter's persuasive abilities. Elena smiled. She inherited her father's determination and her mother's stubbornness. It's a powerful combination. The flight to Guatemala was Marcus's 43rd international trip since they'd begun their consultation work. He'd learned to sleep on planes, to navigate immigration procedures in multiple languages, and to quickly assess the political and social dynamics that affected their work in different countries. But he'd never grown comfortable with the stories They encountered families torn apart by violence, children forced into labor or sexual exploitation, women trapped in situations that made Elena's original experience with Davidson seem almost benign by comparison. "The statistics from the pilot program are encouraging," Carmen said as they settled into their seats. 68 families served in the first year, with an 82% success rate for those who completed the full program. The Guatemala pilot program had been their most ambitious international project, involving partnerships with local NGOs, government agencies, and international donors. Unlike their domestic work, which operated within established legal and social service systems, international programs required navigating complex political environments and cultural differences. "What's our biggest challenge going to be this week?" Marcus asked Elena as the plane taxied toward the runway. Elena consulted her briefing materials, compiled by their research team in Denver. Funding sustainability. The initial grants are ending, and the Guatemalan government needs to commit long-term resources if the program is going to continue. It was a familiar challenge. Their domestic expansion had faced similar obstacles, with some facilities closing when local funding disappeared and others thriving when communities embraced the programs as essential services. Success often depended less on the quality of their model than on the political will to address trafficking and family violence. During the 7-hour flight, Marcus found himself reading case files from families who had been served by their Guatemala partner organization. The stories were heartbreaking, but also inspiring: mothers who had escaped forced labor operations, children who had been reunited with families after years of separation, young women who had survived sexual trafficking and were now studying to become advocates themselves. One file particularly caught his attention. Maria Esperanza Santos. The name was probably coincidental, but it made Marcus smile. Had been forced into domestic servitude when she was 14. After escaping at age 21, she had spent 3 months at the pilot facility before enrolling in a vocational training program. She was now working as a legal assistant, specializing in trafficking cases and supporting other survivors through their recovery. "This one reminds me of Carmen," Marcus said, showing Elena the file. "Same fierce determination to turn personal experience into professional expertise." Elena read over the case summary and nodded. "Maria is actually one of the people Sofia wants to interview for the documentary. Her story represents exactly what we're trying to achieve, not just rescue, but transformation into leadership." They landed in Guatemala City on a clear morning that offered spectacular views of the surrounding volcanoes. Marcus had visited Central America several times during his military service, but always in the context of conflict and instability. Returning as a civilian focused on healing and family preservation offered a completely different perspective on the region. Their local contact, Dr. Isabella Morales, met them at the airport with the kind of warm efficiency that Marcus had learned to associate with successful program directors. She had established the pilot facility 2 years earlier after completing training at their Colorado headquarters, adapting their model to address the specific needs of Guatemalan families. "The families are excited to meet you," Dr. Morales said, as they drove through Guatemala City traffic toward the facility. "Many of them have heard about your work through the documentary. You've become symbols of hope for people who thought recovery was impossible." The facility was located in a converted school building on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by gardens that residents maintained as part of their therapy and vocational training. Marcus was struck by how different it looked from their Colorado facilities, but how familiar it felt: the same atmosphere of safety and purposeful activity, the same sense of people working together toward shared goals. "Dr. Chun, Mr. Chun." A group of children ran toward them as they entered the main courtyard, speaking a mixture of Spanish and indigenous languages that Dr. Morales translated. They had prepared drawings and small gifts to welcome the visitors, part of the art therapy program that Sophia had helped design during her training visits. Elena knelt down to accept the children's gifts, responding in Spanish with the warmth that had made her such an effective advocate over the years. Marcus watched her interact with a shy 6-year-old girl who reminded him of Sophia at that age, serious, observant, protective of the adults around her. "This is Isabella," Dr. Morales explained. "She arrived 3 weeks ago with her grandmother, who escaped a forced labor situation on a coffee plantation. Isabella hasn't spoken much since they arrived, but she's been drawing constantly." Marcus examined the child's drawings, recognizing the visual language of trauma that Sophia had taught him to interpret. Isabella's pictures showed dark figures, pursuing smaller ones, but also included bright flowers and rainbow signs that healing was beginning. The tour of the facility revealed adaptations that reflected local culture and resources. Instead of individual family apartments, they had created extended family groupings that honored traditional kinship patterns. The job training programs focused on skills relevant to the Guatemalan economy: textile production, agriculture, small business development. The most successful innovation has been the Grandmother Program, Dr. Morales explained as they visited a workshop where older women were teaching traditional weaving techniques to younger residents. "We found that many trafficking victims had been separated from extended family networks that could provide support. Pairing survivors with respected elders has accelerated recovery significantly." Carmen was documenting everything with the thoroughness that had made her such an effective medical researcher. "Are you collecting data on family reunification rates?" she asked. "And what about long-term follow-up with program graduates?" "We're tracking outcomes for up to 2 years post-graduation," Dr. Morales replied. "The results are promising, but we need longer-term studies to really understand impact." That afternoon, they met with government officials who would decide whether to continue funding the program. The meeting took place in a formal conference room that felt worlds away from the warmth and energy of the facility. But Marcus had learned that policy change often happened in sterile environments, far removed from the human realities they were trying to address. "Minister Lopez," Elena began, "the pilot program has demonstrated that comprehensive services for trafficking victims can be successfully implemented within Guatemala's existing social service infrastructure. The question now is whether the government is committed to making this a permanent part of your response to family violence." The conversation that followed was diplomatic but direct, with officials asking detailed questions about costs, outcomes, and political implications. Marcus contributed by describing the economic benefits they had documented in their U.S. programs: reduced crime rates, increased tax revenue from employed survivors, decreased demand for emergency social services. "What concerns me, Minister," Lopez said frankly, "is whether this model is sustainable without ongoing international support. We cannot create programs that depend permanently on foreign funding." It was a legitimate concern that Elena had anticipated. "Our experience in Colorado suggests that communities will invest in these programs once they see the results," she replied. "But the transition from pilot to permanent status requires political leadership willing to make difficult budget decisions." Carmen spoke up from her position as the team's medical expert. "Minister, I'd like to add that the healthcare savings alone justify continued investment. Trafficking victims who receive comprehensive services require significantly less emergency medical care over time. The program pays for itself within 3 years." After the government meetings, they returned to the facility for dinner with current residents and program graduates. Marcus found himself seated next to Maria Santos, the young woman whose case file had caught his attention during the flight. "Dr. Morales tells me you're working as a legal assistant now," Marcus said in his improving Spanish. Maria nodded with quiet pride. "I help other women understand their rights and navigate the court system. Many survivors don't know that they have legal options, that they can seek justice for what happened to them." "What made you decide to work in the legal field?" Elena asked, joining their conversation. When I was at the facility, I met a lawyer who was volunteering with the program. Maria explained. She treated me like someone whose opinions mattered, not just a victim who needed to be saved. I realized that law could be a tool for protecting people instead of just punishing them. It was exactly the kind of transformation that their work was designed to achieve, survivors discovering their own power and using it to help others. Marcus thought about all the former residents of their facilities who had gone on to become social workers, teachers, nurses, and advocates. That evening, Sophia's documentary crew filmed interviews with program participants, capturing stories that would be included in the second season of her series. Marcus watched from behind the cameras as residents shared their experiences with a level of openness that still amazed him after all these years. The hardest part wasn't escaping, one young woman told Sophia. It was believing that I deserved something better. This place didn't just give me safety, it gave me permission to dream again. Sophia's questions were gentle but probing, revealing the artistic sensibility that had made her such an effective advocate for trafficking survivors. She understood that healing involved not just addressing trauma, but also rediscovering creativity, hope, and connection to others. Late that night, Marcus and Alina stood on the roof terrace of their hotel, looking out over Guatemala City's lights and discussing the day's meetings. The sounds of urban life filtered up from the streets below: traffic, music, conversation, reminders that their work was part of a much larger human story. "Do you think they'll continue the program?" Marcus asked. Elena was quiet for a moment, considering everything they had observed and heard. "I think Minister Lopez understands the value, but he's worried about political sustainability. We need to make sure the program has strong local champions who can advocate for it when we're not here. Maria seems like someone who could fill that role," Marcus suggested. "And Dr. Morales has the credibility to influence government policy. The real test will be what happens when the next administration takes power," Elena replied. "Programs like this survive when they become essential to communities, not when they depend on the support of individual politicians." As they prepared to return to their room, Marcus reflected on how different this trip felt from their early international consultations. The work was becoming less about introducing new concepts and more about supporting local leaders who had adapted their model to fit their own community's needs. 15 years ago, he said to Alina as they waited for the elevator, "did you ever imagine we'd be having these conversations?" Alina smiled. 15 years ago, I was just trying to keep my daughters alive. Everything since then has been a gift, the chance to heal, to build something meaningful, to help other families find their own strength." The elevator arrived, and as they rode up to their floor, Marcus thought about tomorrow's schedule. More meetings, more interviews, more planning for programs that would serve families they would probably never meet. It was work that required patience, persistence, and faith that small actions could create lasting change. But it was also work that had given their lives profound meaning, transforming their own survival story into a foundation for helping thousands of other families discover that escape was possible, recovery was real, and hope could flourish even in the darkest circumstances. 20 years had passed since Marcus first saw 3 figures bound to a fence in the Arizona desert. And today he found himself standing in that same location, now marked by a simple bronze plaque that read, "Where hope begins, transformation follows," in memory of all who have found the courage to start again. The memorial had been Sophia's idea, part of a larger art installation she'd created for the 20th anniversary of their rescue. The fence itself was gone, replaced by a healing garden where desert wildflowers bloomed in carefully tended beds. Visitors came from around the world to see this place where a chance encounter had sparked a movement that now spanned 6 continents. Elena stood beside him, her silver hair gleaming in the morning sun as she read aloud from the guest book that visitors had signed. Stories from dozens of countries, written in multiple languages, all describing how their work had touched lives they would never know. Listen to this one, Elena said, her voice touched with wonder even after all these years. From a woman in Bangladesh who escaped a textile factory where she was held in debt bondage. She writes, "Your story gave me hope that survival was just the beginning. Today I run a cooperative that employs 50 women in fair working conditions." Marcus smiled, thinking about the ripple effects that continued to amaze him. The Esperanza model had been adapted and implemented in 43 countries, with each program tailored to local needs and cultural contexts. They had trained over 2,000 advocates, social workers, and program directors who carried their approach into communities around the globe. Carmen approached from the parking area. Now 37 and serving as executive director of the International Esperanza Foundation. She had stepped into leadership 3 years earlier when Elena decided to transition into an advisory role, bringing her medical expertise and administrative skills to managing their worldwide operations. The documentary crew is set up about a quarter-mile down the road, Carmen reported. Sophia wants to film the commemorative ceremony here first, then move to the original site for some closing interviews. Sophia's original documentary series had evolved into an ongoing project that chronicled the stories of trafficking survivors worldwide. Now 33 and a respected filmmaker in her own right, she had established a production company dedicated to telling stories of resilience and social change. Her work had influenced policy, generated millions in donations, and inspired countless individuals to become advocates in their own communities. Where is she now? Elena asked, scanning the horizon for signs of the film crew. Getting some aerial footage with the drone, Carmen replied. She says the garden looks completely different from above, like a flower blooming in the desert. It was a poetic description that captured something essential about their work. What had begun as a desperate rescue had grown into something beautiful and life-giving, but it required constant tending to flourish in harsh conditions. As they walked through the memorial garden, Marcus reflected on the changes that 20 years had brought. The Esperanza Network now operated 127 facilities across the United States, serving over 800 families at any given time. Their international programs had helped establish similar services in countries as diverse as Thailand, Nigeria, Colombia, and Romania, but perhaps more importantly, they had helped shift the conversation about trafficking and family violence. From one focused solely on law enforcement to one that prioritized survivor support and community healing. Universities offered degree programs based on their model. Governments had adopted their policy recommendations, and thousands of survivors had become leaders in the movement. Remember when our biggest worry was whether we could afford to keep one facility open? Elena said as they paused at a bench surrounded by blooming Palo Verde trees. Marcus nodded, thinking about those early years when every month had been a struggle to meet payroll and maintain basic services. Financial stability had come gradually, built on the foundation of proven outcomes and growing community support. Now the International Esperanza Foundation operated with an annual budget of over $50 million, funded through a combination of government contracts, private donations, and social enterprise ventures. Sophia appeared over a nearby ridge, camera in hand, and followed by her small documentary crew. At 33, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had found her calling early and pursued it with unwavering dedication. Her art therapy innovations had been adopted by programs worldwide, and her advocacy work had influenced international treaties on trafficking prevention. "The light is perfect," Sophia announced as she approached. "And I got some beautiful shots of the wildflowers. Nature's way of reclaiming a place where terrible things happened." The commemorative ceremony began with remarks from local officials, including the current sheriff, who had worked closely with their organization to develop protocols for identifying and supporting trafficking victims. Representatives from the FBI, Border Patrol, and various advocacy organizations had gathered to recognize the anniversary and discuss ongoing challenges. 20 years ago, the sheriff said, addressing the assembled crowd. This was just another stretch of empty highway where bad things happen to vulnerable people. Today, it's a symbol of hope and a training ground for law enforcement officers, learning to see victims as people deserving protection rather than problems to be solved. Marcus was invited to speak, though public speaking had never been his favorite part of the work. He preferred the hands-on aspects, meeting with families, developing programs, solving practical problems. But he had learned over the years that telling their story was essential for inspiring others to take action. Elena likes to say that we didn't choose this work, it chose us. Marcus began, looking out at the faces gathered around the memorial garden. But I think the truth is more complex than that. We were chosen by circumstance, but we chose how to respond. And that choice to see strangers as family, to treat desperate situations as opportunities for transformation, that's a choice available to everyone. Elena followed with remarks that placed their work in the broader context of social justice and human rights advocacy. She had become a respected voice in international policy circles, regularly consulting with the United Nations, World Health Organization, and other global institutions on trafficking prevention and survivor support. The most important lesson we've learned, Elena said, is that healing is contagious. When one family recovers from trauma and rebuilds their life, they become a source of hope and practical support for other families facing similar challenges. Our job isn't to save people. It's to create conditions where people can save themselves and each other. Carmen spoke about the medical innovations that had emerged from their work, including trauma-informed healthcare protocols that were now standard practice in many hospitals and clinics. Her research on the long-term health impacts of trafficking had influenced treatment approaches worldwide. Sophia's presentation focused on the power of storytelling to change hearts and minds. Her documentaries had reached over 200 million viewers globally, but more importantly, they had created platforms for survivors to share their own stories and advocate for policy changes. Art and advocacy aren't separate things, Sophia explained. They're both ways of helping people see possibilities they didn't know existed. When someone watches a documentary about a trafficking survivor who became a lawyer, or sees an art installation created by someone who escaped forced labor, they start to understand that recovery isn't just possible, it's probable, if we create the right conditions. After the formal ceremony, they gathered for a private moment at the exact spot where Marcus had first seen Elena, Carmen, and Sophia tied to the fence. The location was marked now by a simple stone cairn, surrounded by native plants that bloomed throughout the year. What do you think Roberto would say about all this? Marcus asked Elena as they stood together in the place where their lives had intersected. Elena was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. I think he would be amazed by who his daughters became. Carmen saving lives through medicine. Sophia changing minds through art. But mostly, I think he would be proud that we turned our pain into purpose. Carmen and Sophia joined them at the cairn. 4 people who had become a family through circumstances they never could have imagined. The bonds between them had been forged in crisis, but strengthened through years of shared work and mutual support. I've been thinking about the future, Carmen said. About succession planning and making sure our work continues beyond our generation. It was a conversation they had been having more frequently as Elena approached 70 and Marcus neared retirement age. The organization they had built was now larger than any individual, but leadership transitions were always delicate for nonprofits built around charismatic founders. Angela Santos has agreed to serve as interim director when I step down, Elena announced. She spent the past 5 years overseeing our Latin American programs, and she understands both the practical and philosophical foundations of our work. Angela's journey from trafficking victim to organizational leader represented exactly the kind of transformation their work was designed to achieve. Now 45 and holding a master's degree in public administration, she had become one of the most respected voices in the international anti-trafficking movement, What about the next generation of advocates? Sophia asked. The survivors who are just beginning their recovery journeys? Elena smiled, thinking about the hundreds of former residents who had gone on to careers in social work, law enforcement, healthcare, and advocacy. They're already out there, building programs we haven't even imagined yet. Our job is to support them and get out of their way when they're ready to lead. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the desert memorial garden, they prepared for the final documentary interviews that would conclude Sophia's anniversary project. The questions would focus on lessons learned, challenges overcome, and hopes for the future. But before facing the cameras, they took one last walk through the garden, reading the plaques that honored specific families who had found healing through their programs. Each plaque told a brief story: a mother who became a teacher, children who grew up to become advocates, families who rebuilt their lives and went on to help others do the same. This one always gets to me, Sophia said, stopping at a plaque near the center of the garden. It read, "In memory of Maria Santos Esperanza, age 14 to 28, survived trafficking, became a lawyer, saved 37 families before her death from cancer. Her legacy continues through the advocates she trained and the lives she touched." Maria had been one of their first international success stories, a young woman they had met during their early work in Guatemala, who had become a powerful advocate before her untimely death. Her story had been featured prominently in Sophia's documentaries, inspiring countless other survivors to pursue careers in advocacy and law. She used to say that surviving was just the first step, Elena remembered. The real victory was using your survival to help other people escape. As the sun began to set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Marcus of countless evenings spent planning programs and dreaming about expanded services, they gathered for the final interview of Sophia's anniversary documentary. The questions came from Sophia, but could have been asked by any journalist documenting their work over the years. What had they learned? What were they most proud of? What advice would they give to other families facing a crisis? What did they hope their legacy would be? Marcus found his answer in the faces around him. Lena, whose strength had inspired thousands of other women to leave dangerous situations. Carmen, whose medical expertise had saved lives and influenced treatment protocols worldwide. Sophia, whose art had given voice to survivors and changed public perception of trafficking victims. Our legacy isn't really about us, Marcus said to the camera. It's about every family that found safety, every child who grew up to become an advocate, every community that decided to treat trafficking survivors as neighbors rather than problems. We just provided some tools and got out of the way. Elena added her own perspective. 20 years ago, we were victims of circumstances beyond our control. Today, we're part of a global movement of people who refuse to accept that vulnerable families should suffer in silence. That transformation from powerlessness to agency, that's what real recovery looks like. Carmen spoke about the future. The next generation of advocates will face challenges we can't even imagine yet. New forms of exploitation, different technologies, changing political landscapes. But they'll also have resources and knowledge that we didn't have when we started. I'm optimistic about what they'll accomplish. Sophia's final comment was typically artistic. This garden exists because someone chose to stop and help when they saw people in crisis. Every flower here represents a choice that someone made to see possibilities instead of just problems. That's the real lesson. Transformation happens one choice at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time. As the cameras stopped rolling and the documentary crew began packing their equipment, the four of them sat quietly on the bench, surrounded by desert wildflowers. 20 years of shared work, countless crises navigated together, thousands of families helped toward healing and independence. So what's next? Sophia asked, echoing a question they had asked each other countless times over the years. Elena laughed, the sound carrying across the desert evening. More of the same, I suppose. Families will need help, advocates will need training, communities will need resources. The work continues. But we've built something that can continue without us, Carmen added. Programs that train their own leaders. Survivors who become advocates, communities that take ownership of the solutions. Marcus looked around at the memorial garden, thinking about all the people who would visit this place in years to come. Some would be tourists curious about a remarkable story. Others would be advocates seeking inspiration for their own work. Still others might be survivors looking for proof that recovery was possible and transformation was real. The fence is gone, he said simply, but the hope remains. As they walked back to their cars in the gathering darkness, Marcus reflected on the unexpected path his life had taken. A solitary medical supply driver had become part of a global movement. A chance encounter had evolved into life's work, and a moment of crisis had become the foundation for decades of healing. Behind them, solar lights illuminated the memorial garden, ensuring that this place of transformation would remain visible to travelers even in the darkness. Ahead of them lay whatever challenges and opportunities the future would bring. Faced with the confidence that came from 20 years of building hope from the wreckage of trauma, the story that had begun with 3 figures tied to a desert fence had become something larger than any of them could have imagined, a testament to the power of choice, the strength of family, and the possibility that anyone, anywhere, could find the courage to start again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.